Parker O'Neill woke up to find her hand frozen to the rail. With just a bit of force, her skin would tear off. She gritted her teeth and yanked her hand until she finally freed it. However, the most pressing issue wasn't the pain in her hand, but the long-held urge to pee. She glanced at her friend Joe Lynch sitting next to her, then quietly wet her pants. At that moment, she deeply regretted everything. She wouldn't have been in such a humiliating situation. It all started the day before when she, Dan Walker, and Joe Lynch went to the ski resort. To save on tickets, Dan persuaded Parker to flirt with the ticket clerk by pretending she had lost her wallet, fabricating a story about losing her wallet, and asking if she and her two friends could ride the lift for free. The seller, thinking about all three girls, agreed for the free ride. That night, however, Parker showed up with Dan and Joe, which upset the seller, who refused to let them in and claimed the resort was closing soon. But Dan, feeling angry, threatened to puncture the seller's tires if he didn't let them ride the lift. Not wanting any trouble, the seller gave in and allowed them to board, unknowingly setting the stage for disaster. Soon after, another staff member came to take over. The seller, about to leave, told his replacement there were still 3 people on the lift, and once they were down, he could close the resort. Not long after the seller left, 3 other skiers descended from the lift, and the new staff member assumed these were the people the seller mentioned. Without hesitation, he turned off the power, and the lift came to a stop mid-air. Dan, Parker, and Joe thought it was a joke at first, but when the lights of the entire resort went out, they began to panic. They shouted for help, but no one responded. They realized they were trapped, and the resort only opened on weekends. This meant they would be stuck there for 5 days. To make matters worse, a snowstorm began to rage, with icy winds cutting through them like knives. Before long, frostbite started forming on Parker's face, and they knew if they didn't act soon, they would freeze to death. Desperate, Dan pushed open the railing, deciding to jump down for help. He leaped from the lift, but as soon as he hit the ground, the bones in his legs pierced through his knees. His legs were torn beyond repair, and he was completely immobilized. The others considered jumping as well, but Dan quickly warned them not to. Seeing his broken legs, Parker was terrified. She threw her scarf down to help him bandage his wounds, but it landed too far. Dan, in agonizing pain, managed to reach the scarf after several attempts and tied it around his leg to stop the bleeding. Just as they began to feel a small sense of relief, they heard a wolf's howl in the distance, and their nerves were on edge. Wolves were roaming the area, and Dan, filled with fear, shouted for help, but there was no one around to hear them. With no other option, Joe noticed a ladder on a nearby support pole that led to the ground. If they could climb the lift cables, they might reach safety. Joe decided to take the risk. He carefully stood up, gripping the lift's arm tightly. Fearing he might fall, he climbed onto the seat back and started crawling along the cable. Joy, terrified, hurried back into the lift, realizing that it had already become covered in ice. They began to clear the ice, but as they did, an ice chunk fell and struck Dan in the face, causing him to wince in pain. Amidst their frantic efforts, they heard another low growl. Parker quickly threw a snowboard down, scaring the wolves back into the woods, giving them some more time. But the wolves could return at any moment, so they had to act fast. Joe climbed back onto the cable, and after gathering his courage, he began moving forward again. Soon, he froze, looking down in horror. He quickly returned to the lift, but Parker was determined to continue. Below, several wolves had surrounded Dan, ready to attack. Moments later, there was silence as the wolves tore him apart. Joe and Parker were devastated. Joe blamed Parker, telling her that if she hadn't insisted on sneaking in, they wouldn't have been trapped, and Dan would still be alive. Feeling guilty, Parker leaned on Joe's shoulder, sobbing, and the two eventually drifted off to sleep. When Parker woke up at dawn, she found her hand frozen to the railing again. In desperation, she yanked it free, peeling off her skin in the process. The noise woke Joe, and he looked at the bloodied metal, realizing the grim reality. He tried to comfort Parker, saying that people would come soon, but hours passed, and no one showed up. Joe decided they couldn't wait any longer. He began climbing again, but this time, the bolts holding the lift began to loosen, causing it to tilt dangerously toward Parker. If the bolts gave way, the entire lift would crash to the ground. Joe hurried, but his heavy snow boots made it difficult. His strength was fading, and to make matters worse, a wolf appeared below, eyeing him like prey. Fortunately, Joe managed to crawl onto the next lift, escaping the wolf. However, more wolves gathered beneath them, and they realized descending was a death sentence. Joe instructed Parker to throw down a ski pole to fend off the wolves, and he resumed his climb. With experience from his earlier attempt, he quickly reached the ladder and cautiously climbed down, but as soon as he reached the ground, a wolf attacked. He grabbed the ski pole and plunged it into the wolf's stomach, causing it to flee. Joe ran to the snowboard, sat down, and shouted to Parker that he will definitely come back with some help. Then, he slid down the mountain. As he left, the wolves howled and chased after him. Parker, still trapped in the lift, could only pray that Joe would make it to safety. Night fell, and Parker sat alone in the lift, hoping Joe would return with help. But as dawn broke, no one came. Devastated, Parker couldn't believe Joe had abandoned her. Desperate, She looked for an escape. Dan's body had already been buried under the snow, and she thought that jumping down might be safe. She moved to the edge of the lift and jumped to the ground. But just as she had a moment of relief, the cable snapped and the lift crashed to the ground, crushing her legs. Unable to walk, Parker crawled toward the top of the hill. Just as she neared the summit, she saw a pool of blood. Looking up, she saw a wolf staring at her. It was clear now that Joe hadn't made it out alive. Resigned to her fate, Parker prepared for death. But to her surprise, the wolf turned and walked away, having already fed on Joe. Parker, using the last of her strength, crawled to the roadside, where she collapsed. Shortly after, a passerby found her and kindly brought her to safety. The movie ends here. If you like the explanation, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like, and let us know which movie you want to watch next.